New York City has over 8 million people. That is more than 38 entire US states. It generates roughly 60% of New York State's GDP, an economy that, measured alone, would rank among the top 15 nations on Earth. But here is what almost nobody realizes. New York City cannot set its own tax rates. It cannot control its own transit system. It cannot decide its own housing policy. The most powerful city in the Western Hemisphere answers to a state capital 4 hours north with a fraction of its population. Every other state is a state that contains cities. New York is the opposite. It is a city trapped inside a state. And the reason that happened starts with a single decision made 200 years ago. The Dutch did not choose the mouth of the Hudson River by accident. In the early 1600s, the eastern seaboard was lined with harbors, but almost none of them offered what this one did. A deep, sheltered anchorage connected to a navigable river that reached over 150 miles into the continent's interior. The Hudson cut straight through the Appalachian barrier, carving a low-lying corridor that no other East Coast river could match. Boston had history, but it lacked the river. Philadelphia had the Delaware, but it did not reach as far north or connect as naturally to the interior. Charleston faced south, away from the continent's emerging center of gravity. When the English seized New Amsterdam in 1664 and renamed it New York, they inherited that geographic advantage whole. Ships could sail from the Atlantic into a harbor deep enough for the largest vessels afloat, then transfer goods onto smaller boats that traveled up the Hudson past the highlands and into the Mohawk Valley, the only sea level break in the entire Appalachian chain from Maine to Georgia. Every other East Coast port hit a wall of mountains within 100 miles of the coast. New York hit a highway. That single gap in the mountains would change the fate of the continent. By the 1770s, New York was already growing fast, but it was still just one of several competing colonial ports. Philadelphia was actually larger. Boston was older and better established. Baltimore was rising. If geography alone determined destiny, New York might have remained one among equals, prosperous, important, but not dominant. But having a good harbor was not enough. Plenty of cities had harbors. What turned New York into the Empire State was something no other state was willing to attempt. In the early 1800s, New York State did something audacious. It bet its entire treasury on a 363-mile ditch. The Erie Canal was Governor DeWitt Clinton's obsession, a plan so ambitious that critics called it Clinton's Folly. The idea was simple in concept and staggering in execution. Dig a continuous waterway from the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo, linking the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes and through them to the entire American interior. The state legislature approved a $7 million budget, an enormous sum for the era. Construction began in 1817. Workers, mostly American-born farmers and Irish immigrants, carved through forests, blasted through limestone, and built 83 locks and 18 aqueducts by hand. 8 years later, in October 1825, the canal opened. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Before the canal, shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City cost roughly $100 and took 3 weeks. After the canal, that same ton cost $10 and arrived in 8 days. Within a few years, the price dropped further, to as little as $4 per ton, a 95% reduction in shipping costs almost overnight. Suddenly, grain, timber, and raw materials from the entire Midwest could flow east through New York Harbor. Trade that had been scattered across a dozen ports now funneled through one city. New York went from the 7th largest port in America in the 1790s to the largest by 1830. Population exploded, wealth concentrated. The financial sector that would become Wall Street emerged to manage the rivers of capital pouring through the harbor. The canal paid for itself in under a decade. Tolls erased the construction debt by 1834. Historians mark this as the moment New York earned its nickname, the Empire State. But the canal did not just make New York City powerful, it created a secondary chain of cities along the canal route, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, that would grow, industrialize, and eventually become the other New York. The state was now two places, and those two places would spend the next 200 years fighting over who actually controls it. In 1898, something happened that has no parallel anywhere else in America. 5 separate municipalities, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, merged into a single city government. This was not a suburb being absorbed by a metropolis. Brooklyn was the 4th largest city in the entire country, with its own mayor, its own police force, its own fire department, its own civic identity. It had Prospect Park, designed by the same architects who built Central Park. It had the Brooklyn Bridge, completed just 15 years earlier, already an engineering wonder of the world. Brooklynites did not think of themselves as New Yorkers. They were Brooklynites and proud of it. Many of them did not want to disappear into Manhattan's shadow. The opposition was fierce, and yet the vote passed by exactly 277 votes. Out of nearly 130,000 ballots cast in Brooklyn, the margin was 64,744 to 64,467. A rounding error decided the fate of the greatest city on earth. Farmers in southern and eastern Brooklyn tipped the balance, hoping that consolidation would bring them paved streets, modern sewers, and access to Manhattan's water supply. The urban core of Brooklyn voted against it. They lost by a handful of ballots. On New Year's Eve, 1897, thousands of Brooklynites gathered on the steps of Brooklyn City Hall to mark what they saw as a funeral. A poet read a eulogy called "The Passing of Brooklyn." To this day, some Brooklynites call the consolidation the great mistake of '98. The result was the only city in America that encompasses 5 separate counties. New York City became simultaneously one city government and 5 county governments, an institutional structure unlike anything else in the country. On January 1st, 1898, Greater New York was born with more than 3 million residents, instantly becoming one of the largest cities on the planet. Manhattan alone would grow to a population density exceeding 70,000 people per square mile. This consolidation created a city so large, so dense, and so economically dominant that it immediately dwarfed every other municipality in the state. And that created a problem no one had anticipated. Before the tension between city and state hardened into permanent conflict, New York City did something remarkable with the power it still held. Between 1900 and 1930, reformers turned the city into a laboratory for ideas that would reshape the entire country. The catalyst was tragedy. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, in a blaze that lasted less than 20 minutes. Doors had been locked, fire escapes collapsed, workers jumped from the 8th and 9th floors. The public horror was immediate. Within 2 years, Al Smith and Robert Wagner had pushed 56 factory reform bills through the state legislature in a single session, a burst of lawmaking described at the time as epoch-making. Worker protections, building codes, fire safety standards, all of it forged in the aftermath of that fire. Later, Fiorello LaGuardia took it further, building public housing, expanding parks, professionalizing city services, and demonstrating that activist government could actually work. These ideas did not stay in New York. They flowed directly into Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. The framework that defined 20th century American governance was prototyped on the streets of Manhattan. The policies that shaped modern America did not come from Washington. They came from New York City. But here is the bitter irony. The very state that birthed those policies would eventually build a system designed to prevent the city from making its own decisions ever again. Most Americans assume cities depend on their states for funding. New York is the opposite. Recent fiscal analysis shows that New York City residents and businesses contribute roughly 54.5% of all state revenue, about $68.8 billion per year. In return, the city receives only about 40.5% of state operating expenditures, roughly $47.6 billion. The difference flows upstate. New York City is not a dependent, it is a donor. The global city subsidizes the state that governs it. Think about what that means. Upstate schools, hospitals, roads, and infrastructure depend heavily on tax revenue generated in Manhattan office towers and Brooklyn storefronts. A financial crisis on Wall Street does not just ripple through the 5 boroughs, it sends shockwaves to school budgets in the Adirondacks and road maintenance crews in the Southern Tier. When the pandemic emptied Manhattan offices in 2020, it was not just the city that felt the pain. Tax revenue dropped across the entire state because so much of that revenue originates from a single cluster of zip codes in Lower Manhattan. The city's economy is not just important to the state, it is the engine that keeps the entire state running. And yet, despite generating more than half the state's revenue, New York City cannot independently raise its own taxes, set its own housing policy, or even control the MTA, the transit system that nearly 6 million riders depend on every weekday. The subway, the buses, the commuter rail lines that keep the city's economy functioning, all of it is governed by a state authority whose board is appointed in Albany. The most economically powerful city in the Western Hemisphere has less fiscal autonomy than many mid-sized cities in Texas or Colorado. Cities like Houston and Austin can set their own property tax rates. New York City cannot. That inversion, the engine that funds everything but controls nothing, is the defining tension of New York State. And it is enforced by a legal mechanism most New Yorkers have never heard of. In 1963, New York voters approved a constitutional amendment creating what is called Home Rule, the principle that cities should govern their own affairs. The following year, the municipal Home Rule law was supposed to protect local autonomy. On paper, it forbids the state legislature from interfering with a city's property, affairs, or government. In practice, courts have hollowed that protection out completely. The loophole is a phrase, substantial state interest. Anytime Albany wants to override a New York City decision on taxation, transportation, education, housing, it simply declares the issue a matter of state concern. And courts have accepted that argument almost every time. The congestion pricing saga is a textbook example. New York City spent years developing a plan to toll vehicles entering Manhattan's central business district, a policy designed to reduce traffic, cut emissions, and fund transit improvements. The plan required state legislation to implement. When it was finally approved, the governor unilaterally paused it, overriding the city, the MTA board, and the law itself. The city that designed the policy, that would benefit from the policy, and that would pay the tolls under the policy had no independent authority to implement it. Rent regulation follows the same pattern. The city cannot set its own rules for the housing market that its residents navigate every day. Those rules are debated and decided in Albany, where upstate and suburban representatives hold enormous influence over a policy that affects millions of people they will never meet. Legal scholars now openly ask whether home rule in New York is dead. The city with the largest economy, the most complex infrastructure, and the most diverse population in the country must ask permission from a state capital that depends on its tax revenue to keep the lights on. That is the structural inversion at the heart of New York's identity. And the political divide that enforces it might not be what you think. Most people picture New York's political divide as simple: blue city, red countryside. But that map is wrong. Upstate New York actually has more registered Democrats than Republicans overall. Cities like Buffalo, Albany, Syracuse, and Rochester lean heavily Democratic. The upstate Republican stereotype describes rural counties, but those counties are sparse and shrinking. The real political fault line in New York is not between left and right, it is between two kinds of Democrats. Urban Democrats in New York City want rent regulation, transit funding, and housing density. They represent districts where a one-bedroom apartment can cost $3,000 a month, and a subway delay means a missed shift. Suburban and upstate Democrats want property tax caps, infrastructure spending, and fiscal restraint. They represent districts where a house costs a fraction of a Manhattan studio and the nearest subway stop is 200 miles away. Both sides carry the same party label. Both sides vote in the same primaries. And both sides fight relentlessly over how the state's resources should be allocated. New York's internal political war is increasingly fought within one party, a dynamic unlike almost any other state in the country. The divide is not ideological in the way cable news presents it. It is structural, geographic, and economic, rooted in the same tension that has defined New York since the Erie Canal split the state into two places that cannot agree on what they are. The question surfaces every few years, sometimes as a joke, sometimes deadly serious. What if New York City simply left? If the 5 boroughs became their own state, those 8 million residents and that 60% GDP share would create one of the most powerful states in the Union. Policy preferences on transit, housing, and taxation would translate directly into law without Albany's interference. The city would finally control its own destiny. But upstate would lose its economic lifeline overnight. The rural communities, hospitals, and school districts that depend on city-generated revenue would face an immediate fiscal crisis. Without the billions that flow from Manhattan to every corner of the state, entire regions would struggle to fund basic services. And the city would lose something too. New York City's drinking water flows by gravity from 19 reservoirs spread across 2,000 square miles of upstate watershed, stretching 125 miles into the Catskill and Delaware Mountains. That system delivers over 1 billion gallons per day, and 90% of it arrives unfiltered, so pure that the federal government exempts it from standard filtration requirements. It is one of the largest unfiltered water supplies in the world, and the city cannot replicate it. The agricultural products from the Hudson Valley, the open land that absorbs the pressure of 8 million lives, the political moderation that comes from governing a geographically diverse state, the city needs all of it. Neither half works well without the other. The relationship is antagonistic, codependent, and unlike any other state-city dynamic in America. They cannot live together comfortably, and they cannot survive apart. Look at New York State from space at night. The southeastern corner blazes with a concentration of light that rivals entire nations, 8 million lives compressed into 302 square miles, generating enough economic energy to power a continent. The rest of the state dims quickly. Small cities dot the old canal corridor: Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, fading embers of an industrial age that has passed. Scattered towns glow faintly in the Adirondacks. Dark stretches of farmland and forest fill the spaces in between. The most famous city on earth and the quiet countryside that constrains it, funds it, depends on it, and resents it, bound together inside a single set of borders. New York is the opposite of every U.S. state because it is not really a state in the way Americans understand the word. It is an uneasy alliance between a global city and the territory surrounding it, two places that need each other, disagree on almost everything, and are held together by a constitution written before either one became what it is today. Geography gave New York its harbor. The harbor gave New York its city. The city gave New York its power. And the state has spent 200 years trying to figure out how to contain it. Now, if you want to see how geography shaped another state's fate, watch the video on screen now. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a great time. Thanks for watching.